What's
Okay, here we go. We're starting today. Thank you. Welcome everyone for coming today to our lunch and learn of Rabbi Feurlicht's classic memoir of Hoosier Rabbinate. We're not going to be going through the book point by point, so if you haven't read it before, you should be okay hearing this as a supplement. But if you haven't read the book yet, really, I included it in the email I sent you. Take a look at it. If some things don't make sense in this, perhaps the memoir will help fill in some of those things that I'm going to miss because um, he does go into many, many details of his life, and we can't hit on all of them today. And he was a very, very accomplished person. So I would really recommend go back to the book and go back through it when you get an opportunity. Now, if everyone can put themselves on mute right now during the program, I'd appreciate it. Um, and we'll get into it here. Um, So I wanted you guys to understand a few different ideas during the course of this program. Um, why was he considered the best leader of the Indiana Jewish community at the time, and what makes a good leader in general? How did this rapid period from 1890 to 1950, a time of extreme changes, affect his approach to leadership? How did he try to redefine the idea of rabbi as a type of statesman who looks out for the betterment of the future generations of Jews? And what ways do his views and criticisms on anti Semitism, assimilation, Zionism, conservative Judaism all evolve and change over time? See the various ways that Rabbi Feurlicht walked the tightrope between dogmatic and pragmatism, and the ways that the rabbinate has shifted from Rabbi Feurlicht's period to today. So let's get into this. Um, now, let's take this into consideration. One thing that you really have to understand is that during the course of Rabbi Feurlicht's career, we went from having horse carts to having nuclear weapons during this time of 50 years. This is a time of rapid acceleration, technological acceleration. The world is changing at a pace it's never seen before. And the changes would shift the status quo of Jews during what was known as the Haskalah that started in the mid 19th century, the Jewish Enlightenment, away from the Jewish Enlightenment that Rabbi Feurlicht had adapted as his own views and from what he learned about from his own training at the Hebrew Union College in Cincinnati. Um, what motivated Rabbi Feurlicht, and you'll notice this throughout the book, was creating a sustainable Judaism that could outweigh anti-Semitism, in his opinion, in his way of looking at the world. Whether it did that in the longer term is a completely different story, but this is how he saw it. By placing Jews in the context of American history, insisting that Jews assimilate to an extent into American society and culture, proving that Americans uh, only had loyalty to America exclusively, and fixing the social or economic conditions for local Jews so that they would not be seen as a quote unquote charge on society. Those are the tools that he saw that would deal with anti Semitism and would help Jews integrate into American society and become part of the fabric of American society by and large. Um, and what do you think, ultimately motivates anyone to write a memoir? I mean, this made me ask this question a lot when I was reading this. And one clue is that you want to have a final say on how events may have been perceived, or to explain complicated times for those who may not understand them in the future, or to contextualize or understand what was going on, why did it happen, um, because we there are so many details that we miss out, things that don't make sense unless we understand the times that we're dealing with. And so many things in this memoir, unless you understand a lot of the greater historical patterns that are going on outside of Indiana, don't really make that much sense or even seem kind of provincial to us. Rabbi Feurlicht fundamentally wants to hold on to the belief in the validity of the mid 19th century's values in a world where that seems less realistic, where holding on to the Haskalah, the Jewish Enlightenment of the 19th century, where Jews would trade their distinctiveness for being accepted into the wider society, just as Napoleon had famously said, everything to the Jew and nothing to the Jews as a group. So individually, Jews could become accepted by adapting to the dress, the language, and assimilating into society. Jews individually could be accepted to that society. And that, by and large, was the framework of that Reform Judaism that molded and became Reform Judaism in the 19th century. So what happened in the background is that we have the largest migration of Jews in world history, the biggest exodus of Jews from Tsarist Russia, escaping tyranny and seeking economic opportunity, coming in waves, actually really starting, I would say, possibly maybe even the early 1870s. And Indianapolis really lacked the infrastructure to absorb Jewish immigrants in the way that Chicago or Cleveland was doing. And Indy lacked a diversity of immigrants that other Midwestern cities had. So there wasn't a huge group of Polish or Czech or Slovakian Jewish. There weren't a lot of other ethnic groups. There were some Irish, obviously. A large German migration came to Indianapolis, but there weren't large ethnic groups coming during the age of industrialization to Indianapolis. So the city was rather non-diverse. I mean, there was an African American community that was increasingly coming from the South, but the city still lacked the kind of diversity that many other Midwestern cities had at the time. And that posed specific challenges to the Jewish community that had succeeded and was fairly successful um, at integrating, but was still small and relatively unprepared to deal with a large wave of Jewish immigrants coming into the city. So that's kind of the background. Now, one of the things I want to discuss here is, what is a positive approach to assimilationist policies? And what do we mean by adapting, becoming American? Now, really, what becoming American meant, translated, was really becoming a part of white America, becoming more specifically a part of Protestant America. But obviously the Jewish community didn't want people to completely assimilate. They wanted people to assimilate to the point where they could fit into social structures, get jobs, avoid, kind of street discrimination, things like that, but still remain Jewish at home. There was this idea that the 19th century reform movement under Isaac Mayer Wise wanted to redefine, and he did this. They ultimately created what was called the Pittsburgh Platform in the late 19th century, which described what they wanted classical Reform Judaism to be, the kind of Judaism that Rabbi Feurlicht deeply believed in, which was that we would be Jews in the home, but we would appear like every other white Protestant American outside of it. We would assimilate on our own pace. We would conduct services that, if any non-Jew came to them, would be aesthetically pleasing to them. We would reject anything that culturally didn't fit the mores of 19th century Protestant white America, basically. Um, and so, and furthermore, they wanted to redefine Judaism away from the idea of peoplehood to an idea of being part of just a religious mosaic. So being Jewish was simply being from a different religion, but part of white America, essentially. Um, and in this hope, that if you look at that, it's only, if Jews can be fully accepted as a religion, as merely a religion and no longer a people, that Jews may be fully accepted according to their theory, fully accepted into American society. Um, and this led to the largely German-speaking Jewish cultural elite that had come generations before, deciding to establish an organization called the Industrial Removal Office. It's a terrible name, but they actually did wonderful things of trying to bring Jews from larger cities, New York, mostly New York, Philadelphia, all over America to places like Indianapolis, so that they could assimilate into American society, and they could live in places that were less expensive, not become a charge to society, not ghettoize, as they would say. Um, and that would be a way of pushing back against potential anti-Semitism the way that they saw at the time. Um, and this led this office, the Industrial Removal Office, eventually led to a department that was part of the brand new Jewish Federation of Indianapolis that was formed in the early 1910s, to create sort of a place where, and this Rabbi Feurlicht was very much part of this idea of creating a settlement home where Jews would receive medical aid, they might receive a small loan, they could receive um, even dental care there, language courses, but they had to do the work. They had to, and there was a small, and we'll discuss a little bit later, a small house um, called the Morris Home, and the Morris Home the Nathan Morris Home was created as a settlement house, like the Toll House in Chicago, where kids could get basic education. They had a kindergarten, a preschool, activities for kids. It was really everything that you needed, including help with any legal troubles you might come into. There were really literally departments to help and but what was expected was that they were going to go to their language courses. They would go to Americanization courses where they would basically learn, like, here is the etiquette of, of kind of white America at the time. Here, you do this and you don't do this. You don't talk, you talk with your hands less, so on and so forth, to become conditioned to living as a small minority in a mostly Anglophile society at the time in Indianapolis. Um, and Rabbi Feurlicht really embraced this idea. I mean, he really, really believed in that model. And we'll find out how he kind of got involved in that. So that's kind of the background of the period. Now, Rabbi Feurlicht himself was born in Tokay in the Austro-Hungarian Empire in 1879. And Tokay is kind of this really fascinating place because there were both large Hasidic groups and there were also groups of Hungarian Jews who embraced the Haskalah there. There was both. It was actually wine country. It's a beautiful, beautiful place in Hungary. They're still very, very famous for their wine. Even back then in America, they were very famous for their wine. And so being born in kind of, they called it Mittel Europa, Middle Europe, where Yiddish speakers and German speakers were mutually understandable, gave him a very firm foundation for being able to talk to kind of the German speaking Jewish elite in America and being able to also understand the Yiddish speaking Eastern European Jews, of which his father was actually an Orthodox rabbi and actually graduated from a famous rabbinical school in the Austro-Hungarian Empire. So he understood Orthodoxy, and so he was sort of, Hungarian Jews kind of existed in this interesting place where they were sort of the middlemen between communities. And even in Indianapolis, you'll notice that the older IHC was actually taken over by the Hungarian synagogue, um, congregation congregation Ohev Zedek, um, because the Hungarians were kind of seen as this middle community between the Yiddish-speaking Russian Jewish immigrants who were Orthodox and the German-speaking Reform community, who were largely Reform or even secular. Um, and so his first pulpit was actually in Lafayette, um, at what is today Temple. I think it was called Ahavat Achim back then. Today it's called Temple Israel. And he served there between 1901 and 1904. He actually met his wife there. He also, even back then, started becoming engaged in helping Jewish immigrants in Lafayette. There were also Jewish immigrants who came to Lafayette during that period that he was engaged in working with. And even before then, when he was in rabbinical school in Cincinnati, he also worked with Jewish immigrants. And I think part of that was because his own parents and he himself came here as a young person, and his parents were immigrants, and he certainly saw their struggles that they went through, and had a type of deep empathy for them. And so he started in rabbinical school in Cincinnati. He was an amazing student. He really accelerated. He really believed in the ideals of Rabbi Isaac Mayer Wise, and we'll get to sort of his ideological family tree, if it were, a little bit later. And Rabbi Feurlicht, above all, really loved to write. In fact, he even entertained leaving the rabbinate behind to take over his father-in-law's newspaper after he passed away. Thankfully, he didn't do that. Later on, he became the editor of the Indianapolis Jewish Chronicles. Um, and here's just an idea of just some of the few charitable organizations that Rabbi Feurlicht worked with, founded or led. Um, the Indianapolis Family Welfare Society, he founded and served as the first director of the Social Welfare Society. The American Red Cross in Marion County, he was a founder of the local chapter. The National Conference of Christians and Jews. Um, the Children's Aid Association. Today, it's now known as Families First. He served for 20 years as the president of the Juvenile Court Auxiliary. He was on the State Board of Charities and Corrections. He was the first Jew appointed to this board in 1920 to 1931. He was in the County Board of Welfare, the Indiana State Conference of Charities. He served as the first Jewish president, first non-Christian president of this organization. He was on the juvenile justice system, promoted pioneering a system in Indiana with Judge George W. Stubbs. And he was part of the Jewish Welfare Board in World War One that shared the body for Jewish soldiers coming into the city. So you can see, and this is just a fragment of the different various charities that Rabbi Feurlicht was involved with during his time as a rabbi in Indianapolis. And part of the one of the things that I think that why he got involved in so many different Jewish organizations is that his predecessor, Rabbi Messing, was also involved deeply with many different non-Jewish and Jewish charities in Indianapolis, everything from the Humane Society to the School for the Blind. And he was really sort of a on one hand, he had some very big shoes to fill, but on the other hand, he had a very good template for how to move into this rabbinical position um, through Rabbi Messing, who he lived a fairly long life. He lived well into the early 1930s, and from what I understand, he did not criticize Rabbi Feurlicht. He let Rabbi Feurlicht kind of grow and bloom into the position rather than this rabbi who sticks around and everyone compares them to each other. He played a really positive role, and Rabbi Feurlicht moving up to the position. But like I said, again, I want to reiterate, really, his background set him up for success at this very critical period in Indianapolis's Jewish history. Um, so, so at this time, what was going on in IHC is that IHC had seen a decrease in membership and the final quarter of 50 years of Rabbi Messing's leadership because Jews were becoming more secular, they were moving away, they were intermarrying. And this is in the early 1910s. Conservative Judaism, founded by the likes of Jacob Schiff, was rapidly growing, with many Jewish immigrants joining. Um, and that was also kind of seen as a direct threat to Reform Judaism at the time. Um, and Rabbi Feurlicht realized the future of IHC was engaging with the children of recent Jewish immigrants to entice them to join IHC eventually. And so here's a quote from Rabbi Feurlicht about the neighborhood at the time when he first arrived in Indianapolis. When I left Lafayette to begin my new work in the capital city, the state back in the fall of 1904, I found an enlarged opportunity for just this kind of modernized social service. Local conditions were especially favorable. The Indianapolis Hebrew congregation consisted of some 200 families, most of whom were resident within an area of a few blocks of the home of James Wickham Riley, who was a common friend of the neighborhood. So you can kind of get an idea of what IHC's neighborhood was like in the late 19th century in the Lockerbie neighborhood of Indianapolis, which is very, very well preserved. And it's a real delight to visit if you haven't been there before. I recommend going to James Wickham Riley's home. So he was also a pioneer, by the way, in helping Jewish college students uh, at IU. He was him and his colleague Rabbi Henry Englander both kind of took turns going down to Bloomington in the early 1920s, meeting with Jewish students even before Hillel was founded several years later. And this followed a similar pattern of one of Rabbi Feurlicht's inspirations, Rabbi Leo Franklin, who was doing something similar from his pulpit in Detroit with the University of Michigan. So I think he sort of drew some inspiration from Rabbi Leo Franklin, who we'll go into in a minute, um, of Detroit. Rabbi Feurlicht also had a very, very warm embrace of the Sephardic community in Indianapolis. He helped them gain their Torahs. He helped them gain a lot of acceptance. What's interesting is that uh, German Jewish communities tended to really look towards Sephardic communities for inspiration and even adapted some of their customs. So, for example, in German-speaking Jewish communities, boys before marriage, after bar mitzvah, will start wearing the large talit. That's something that Sephardic Jews do that no other Ashkenazim do besides German-speaking Ashkenazim who adapted that Sephardic custom. And here's a lovely picture of the Sephardic community on the south side of Minneapolis. Um, and another really, really interesting facet was that Rabbi Feurlicht loved doing interfaith work. And again, he saw himself as kind of a statesman of the Jewish community. He kind of connected to different world leaders when they came to Indianapolis and different cross cultural opportunities at IHC. And in 1904, the Chinese ambassador Wang Kai, who was visiting Indianapolis, spoke as a guest of Rabbi Feurlicht on Shabbat Friday evening during Hanukkah on Christmas and shared with the Indianapolis Hebrew congregation a discussion about the history and current status of Chinese Jews. Rabbi Feurlicht gave Wang Kai a gift of a 6-volume set by Heinrich Reitz, The History of Jews, build build and build the name of the program was a congregation of Jews to a Buddhist on a Christian holiday. Um, and so as strong as Rabbi Feurlicht's ability was to talk to other Jewish communities, some other Jewish communities and interfaith communities, he had a really strong rivalry with the conservative movement. And there was a nascent attempt to establish a conservative synagogue in Indianapolis by a young Rabbi Hoffman who had just graduated from JPS and he was accompanied by Rabbi Solomon Schechter. And what's interesting is that um, Rabbi Feurlicht decided to invite them, even though he wasn't the biggest fan of Rabbi Schechter, to and allowed him to speak. And what's really interesting about this is that if you think about it, IHC in 1899 at its dedication ceremony had Rabbi Isaac Mayer Wise, who's really one of the biggest stalwarts of Reform Judaism in the 19th century, speak there. And then you also in the early 20th century at the same building, you have Rabbi Solomon Schechter, one of the stalwarts, really fathers of conservative Judaism in America, speak at IHC as well. But what I find kind of astonishing about this is that Rabbi Feurlicht years later can't help but kind of criticize the way that they dressed, where he kind of describes them as kind of shabby and dressed overly traditional and long kaftans and big kippot and big yarmulkes. This is definitely not the dress of the day at IHC, and he kind of mocks it a little bit because you can tell that he doesn't like the conservative movement. He thinks that it's just kind of a disguised version of orthodoxy, but without all of the nostalgia that he likes about orthodoxy. He's a real critic of it, and it really shows in how he kind of talks about Rabbi Solomon Schechter and Rabbi Hoffman. And the early conservative synagogue, I'm trying to remember the name of it. I think it was maybe referred to as the Union Shul. It didn't last very long, and it quickly was absorbed by one of the Orthodox synagogues on the south side of Indianapolis. And there wouldn't be another attempt at conservative Judaism until really the mid 1920s. Here's another picture of Rabbi Schechter. And really, it came into focus when Rabbi Milton Steinberg came to town, who was part of the Reconstructionist branch of conservative Judaism that really affirmed the idea of Jewish peoplehood. That that Rabbi Feurlicht didn't like that idea. He liked the idea that Jews were part of a religious mosaic, a part of that classical reform position. And he really, really didn't like Rabbi Steinberg's idea of looking at Jewish peoplehood first and the religious aspects of Judaism second. And people often derided him, the young rabbi, by calling him Mr. Steinberg rather than rabbi in some of IHC circles. He went on to be a brilliant author. He wrote As a Driven Leaf and a book on basic Judaism. His life was cut short, and he wasn't in Indianapolis for very long, but he left a very, very big impact because he helped unite Bethel with Ohav Zedek and created Bethel Zedek, and also fostered that made for one of the early major Jewish mergers in Indianapolis history. So one of the incredible things about Rabbi Feurlicht was that he had a very close friendship with Rosenwald, and Rosenwald had this idea of expanding Black athletic centers across America, and he came to Rabbi Feurlicht, and Rabbi Feurlicht said, "Sure, yeah, let's expand that to Indianapolis." So they together helped to build a Black athletic center in Indianapolis, which at the time many African Americans could not go to any of the established athletic clubs in Indianapolis because they were segregated. That's just a small part of what Rosenwald's efforts were to increase equality and to break down the barriers of segregation in America. But it's an example of Rabbi Feurlicht's dedication to trying to make a better Indianapolis for other marginalized groups in the city. And Rabbi Feurlicht was also he taught a course in Hebrew Bible um, for over 30 years. And he was one of the first rabbis to teach there. And there were rabbis after him still teaching at Butler all the way up to the pandemic in 2020 after Rabbi Feurlicht. Rabbi Feurlicht, if you're wondering where his influences come from, who kind of influences I get, this is Rabbi Leo Franklin, who was actually born in, I'm trying to remember the small town that he was born in Indiana, of all places. Um, Family quickly moved to Cincinnati, though. Um, but he was really a stalwart supporter of kind of the old school of defending classical Reform Judaism, and he Rabbi Feurlicht was more pragmatic than Rabbi Leo Franklin was. But I think Rabbi Leo Franklin was really, you can see from a lot of decisions that Rabbi Feurlicht made, or a lot of the decisions that he decided to take, are really, really similar to a lot of the decisions that Rabbi Leo Franklin made, a lot of the moves that he made. And so they were also on a lot of different committees. And so you can really see that he drew some inspiration from Rabbi Leo Franklin, who was several years older than him. Um, Rabbi David Phillipson, who was really took over the ideological parts of classical Reform Judaism, and wanted to continue to carry out the Pittsburgh platform well after Rabbi Isaac Wise passed away. He lived into the 1940s, and Rabbi David Phillipson was born in Wabash, Indiana, of all places. And then, of course, Rabbi Kaufman Kohler, who was very influential for Rabbi Feurlicht when he was going to the Hebrew Union College, and very formative and had very similar ideas. Um, so I would say those are the three biggest people who played sort of um, an ideological role in shaping how Rabbi Feurlicht looked at some of these things. Although I would argue that Rabbi Feurlicht was more pragmatic than either Rabbi Leo Franklin or Kaufman Kohler or David Phillipson, who were a little more dogmatic and a little bit older. Which brings us to one idea, which was to create a large synagogue center, big temple center, the way that Rabbi Leo Franklin did, the way that was done in Cleveland earlier. And he even brought in the architect of Temple Bethel in Detroit, Albert Kahn, who, by the way, actually designed a few different buildings in Indiana, a couple of which are in South Bend, and one of which is in Fort Wayne. I can send you that list of Albert Kahn designed buildings in Indiana, but unfortunately, he never got to design a synagogue. But he had these wonderful plans. The Depression came, and they weren't able to raise enough funds. But it's fascinating to think about what could have been, having this massive, gigantic IHC with pools and a JCC, like you know, attached to it. Imagine if you took the whole Jewish campus and you attached it to IHC, and you had this one gigantic um, central for all things Jewish in one place. That was really the idea. And it's unfortunate that it never came to fruition, but we can kind of think about what could have been if the depression hadn't happened when it did. Um, Now, in the 1920s, if anyone's seen the Resist program, I'm not sure if it's ending at the Indiana Historical Society. I think it has ended, unfortunately. But if there's a few days of it, I would recommend going to it. One of the things that I want to point out is that Rabbi Feurlicht was hesitant in the beginning to actually get involved in pushing back against the Klan, and I think maybe part of it could have been fear, or perhaps he just saw them as a group of lunatics and discounted how potentially dangerous they could be. We can't really know for certain. But in 1923, he actually wrote an article saying there is no fear, there is no need for Jews, Catholics, or any other fair-minded American to get excited over the activities of the Ku Klux Klan, declared Rabbi Morris Feurlicht at a meeting of the Knights of Columbus. The Klan appears to be a crystallization of all psychological and unbalanced tendencies in the country at all times. It is pathological conditions that brought about by conditions existing after the war. The only thing for Catholic, Protestant, or Jew to do is to stand upon the common Americanism and the constitutional government. The Klan differs from the Masonic Order, the Knights of Columbus, and similar organizations in that it is founded upon common antipathies and not common sympathies. So, he says that, look, this is basically a group of people that are angry about what happened after the war. It'll go by quickly. Nothing really to worry about. But his attitude, we know, his mindset changes and shifts about the Klan later on, and we know that from the memoir, where he doesn't talk about that early hesitancy he has. But my gut feeling is that he thought at first that this is a movement that was probably going to be targeting the more unassimilated Jews who were living on the south side at the time, rather than going after people like Joseph Block or the people like the Strausses who owned the big department stores downtown. And when they started going after the Blocks and after the assimilated Jews of IHC, he understood that there was something different about this. This was a different type of anti-Semitism. This was a different animal altogether, and he had to work with in tandem with partners, and he boldly spoke out against the Klan. But at first, I think that the Klan was sending two different messages simultaneously. On one hand, the Klan was saying, "Oh, we want everyone to be 100% American," but what they were saying is that they were saying that, yeah, we want you to be 100% American, and there is no way that you can assimilate into that Americanism. There is no way that you as a Jew or as a Catholic or as a Black person can actually assimilate and become 100% American under our quote unquote Americanism. And that is the part that shifted them and made them apart from some of the other groups that had hatred against or xenophobic groups that had hatred of immigrants that simply wanted them to fully assimilate into the society. And Rabbi Feurlicht met with DC Stevenson in his prison cell in Noblesville, his jail cell, and wanted to know what makes this guy tick. You know, where's the source of his hatred coming from? Where does anti-Semitism come from? And I mean, if you read several books, it's not so clear. I mean, for another time, I would like to reapproach this and talk about some possible sources of where the Klan's anti-Semitism came from, some different theories that I have, but we don't have enough time for that today. But he truly looked this true face of evil in the face and really wanted to understand what was driving him, what was motivating all this hate. Because in Rabbi Feurlicht's enlightened world, a person like Stevenson in America was something that was challenging his preconceived notions of American exceptionalism, that America was in fact different, that America was not like the countries of old, where people would judge us no matter, would judge us solely based on being a Jew rather than the content of our character. Um, and so, just as Moses and Aaron were the correct leaders at one period, at one point, at another junction, um, you can see that there's sort of this, when you've been a rabbi for going on 40 years and the entire political climate has changed and the world around you is quickly shifting, and there has been the Spanish flu and World War I and the Great Depression and prohibition and all these other things that were happening so rapidly that challenge um, the worldview that we can fight back against anti-Semitism by assimilating into society and fitting in, um, and having an easier way of debating these ideas. On one hand, you know, I think would make a person feel better that we Jews can just simply change our spots and people will accept us. But that reality seemed very, very unrealistic and was really, really starting to create a contradiction in the way that Rabbi Feurlicht perceived the world or how he understood the world to be or the lessons he was taught in the late 19th century at the Hebrew Union College. That nothing could prepare him for the 20th century and its rapid change. Um, and so Rabbi Feurlicht believed early on that Orthodox Judaism would probably disappear, but he felt that it should be treated with respect, and he he took on high holidays on Rosh Hashanah, he would travel down to the south side on the second day and give the Devar Torah, give the Torah portion talk to the children at the Polish shul in English, um, which is just fascinating because, again, he saw these kids as the future of his congregation. And he also saw these kids as the future in general, not just the future of his congregation. And he also saw that he had even, I would say, even a nostalgia for the Orthodoxy that the Orthodox world that his father came from, even though he was such a proponent of Reform Judaism. And here's a picture, an ad for Knesset Israel, the Rosh Hashanah on the South Side, wishing everyone a Happy New Year. Um, but Feurlicht's fear of Jews being called out for dual loyalty because he didn't want Jews to be seen as a separate people, but Jews just merely as a different religion. And so when the Zionist movement started really growing in the 1920s, for reasons I'll explain a little bit, he was really afraid of Reform congregations performing the Hatikvah. Even in the early 30s, he really denounced it because he saw that it would create um, a source of anti-Semites attacking Jews for quote unquote having dual loyalties, and he was vehemently against that. Although, although in the 1920s he also accepted um, an opportunity to speak at a celebration at Temple Bethel that was celebrating the opening of the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. So because he saw it as widening opportunities for education in the Middle East. So on one hand, he's an anti-Zionist who believes that Zionism is going to create anti-Semitism by creating ideas of dual loyalty. On the other hand, he still understands that he's part of a greater community of people he might disagree with, but he's still willing to speak with them and not completely slam them. Um, but really, this becomes a much greater challenge because the Klan in the 1920s leads America to slamming the door closed on immigrants. So they up the quota to bizarre levels that most Jews can't meet. And so effectively, the door to Jews coming to America that I'm not sure if Rabbi Feurlicht was sure it would close so soon or if it would close at all, came to a shut. And Jews now who had relatives in Russia, had relatives in Poland, had relatives who wanted to get out, now no longer had America as an option. And so Zionism went from being a marginal movement of kind of this pie in the sky idealism, you could call it the Luftmenschen in Yiddish, people live in the clouds, to a strong movement in the mid 1920s because of those proposed changes in immigration. Jews needed to get out, and they needed to have a plan B. And for them, that plan B was Palestine. So that went from a marginal idea that if you would have asked Rabbi Mayor Messing about Zionism in the early 1910s or 1890s, he would have laughed. He said that's, stuff for people whose heads are in the clouds, to a serious movement. Um, and to Rabbi Feurlicht, he was concerned that this movement's going to erode the idea that Jews are only a religion and not a people, which he kept on saying Jews are not a people, we're a religious group. We can be fully accepted. Our whiteness will be fully accepted by society. To a movement that's growing that's saying that Jews are a people first above being merely a religious group. And number two, that we need to seek out an alternative place for Jews to seek refuge because Jews are in danger. They're being hunted down. They're being murdered in Eastern Europe um, by the czars and later by the Bolsheviks. So Jews need a place to get out, and anti-Semitism in other places in Eastern Europe. So what what happens is that um, we'll put that aside for a second. We'll get back into um, where Rabbi Feurlicht was with his kind of um, his debate with Zionists later on. But what we'll talk about a little bit is that Rabbi Feurlicht really wanted to continue continue to push back against anti-Semitism the way that he saw it by putting Jews into the American story. So we're coming on to another, a centennial of America's independence. And back then, Rabbi Feurlicht in 1930 wrote a small book called Judaism's Influence on the Founding of the Republic. And what he decided to do was he would take this book that would talk about how Jews shaped the fathers of American independence, of our founding fathers, and he sent this book to notables all over the United States. And one of the notables he actually sent the book to was Henry Ford. And here's actually a letter coming back from the notorious anti-Semite Henry Ford, actually thanking Rabbi Feurlicht for sending him this book, which I just found fascinating that I found in the American Jewish Archives in Cincinnati. So Rabbi Feurlicht was trying to send this book out, was trying to show how American Jews played an important role, even though Jews were only actually between no more than 2 to 3,000 people in America, in the American colonies at the time. Trying to show that Jews had a role in shaping the beginnings of America. Um, and here is a point that I think was very, very sore for him, that happened because of his like I said, that his definitions of anti-Semitism, he missed how anti-Semitism had leaped and had evolved, and so did his son. And his son, uh, Maurice Feurlicht Jr., wrote, I believe it was a Reader's Digest or another magazine, an entire article that was very, very controversial that talked about how Jews can still blunt anti-Semitism by, changing our ways of dressing, our ways of speaking, and not speaking with the Yiddish dialect, so on and so forth. The same things that Rabbi Feurlicht was saying at the turn of the century, quite naively, probably, most, very naively, we can say. And then he was also going in and talking about how Jews need to get over the fact that we had so many atrocities in our history, like the Crusades, and we just need to forgive our Christian brethren and kind of move on. So one of the people to actually pick up on this was the infamous anti-Semite Father Coughlin, who picked and chose selectively some different quotes from it and kind of ran with it. And people were calling his son, a self-hating Jew and all these awful things, and really, really criticizing his son for publishing this. And Rabbi Feurlicht came to his defense. And there were controversies all over the place because of this outdated way of looking at anti-Semitism and trying, and also kind of ignoring the bigger elephant in the room, which was what was happening in Europe with anti-Semitism, and kind of showing like how out of the loop some people had become in America from what was going on in Europe. Now, I mean, to be fair, Rabbi Feurlicht had denounced Nazism in the mid 1930s to interfaith groups. So he did know that the Nazis were denying Jews' rights in Europe. So the fact that his son wrote this in the late 1930s just boggles the mind. Um, and again, none of this is mentioned in the memoirs, but I think it's important to understand how some of his ideas about countering anti Semitism didn't age very well. But again, we're dealing with 50 years of intense, massive changes going on. And it would be very easy to be very tough on Rabbi Feurlicht in hindsight. But at the time, it also gives you kind of an idea of 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 how detached some American Jews, not all Americans, some American Jews were from what was going on in Europe or what would happen with the Holocaust. And so I think that's why reading memoirs like this are so important, because if you're wondering what American Jews were thinking in the 1930s, this gives you kind of an idea of, even though it was written in the 1950s, after the period, you can go to digitized newspapers and you can look up Rabbi Feurlicht quotations from his article and see how far away he was actually from what was going on at the time in 1937. Um, Now, Rabbi Feurlicht was one of two Indiana rabbis, the other one being from Evansville, that joined the Anti-Zionist American Council on Judaism in 1942. Um, and the AJC was created to oppose the growing Zionist influence on American Reform Judaism, specifically reacting to the 1942 CCAR, that was calling for a Jewish army to fight with the Allies. They didn't want to create what would become the Palmach, which was a Jewish unit in Palestine. They were against that notion because they thought that it would it would create dual loyalties. It's like, having a separate Jewish army when you have Jews serving in your own armies, they thought was a bad idea. But again, they weren't thinking that in 1942, if you look at a map, Al Alamein was not that far away. Rommel was not that far away from Palestine. And these rabbis who were in Atlantic City talking and discussing this, how far away were they from what was going on in Europe? Even though there were newspapers and telegraphs, they were still more or less stuck in the 19th century with the way that they were thinking in terms of classical Reform Judaism, where there were developments happening and changing. And it absolutely boggles the mind. Um, but they were fervent. They did not want to bend on this. They believed fervently that Jews were should serve in the armies that they come from. These Jews should just be a unit within the British Army if they were part of the mandate. So they were fervently against this. And so this created all kinds of debates within the Jewish community in Indianapolis, people who said some not so kind things about Rabbi Feurlicht. And Rabbi Feurlicht actually felt bad about this event. And he actually, in his memoirs, he discusses how, in many different ways, he actually tried to accommodate um, some of the changes that were going on in the Jewish community. For example, and this is something that probably some of his Reform contemporaries would never do from the classical part of the Reform movement, like Rabbi Liam Franklin. He would never have invited Chaim Weizmann to his temple, Bethel in Detroit. But on several different occasions, and Rabbi Feurlicht notes this, because he was really believed in freedom of speech. He actually invited Chaim Weizmann to speak at IHC on several occasions. Chaim Weizmann would come to the solvents plant that he owned in Terre Haute and would stop by Indianapolis on the way to Terre Haute, and he invited him to come and speak. And so Rabbi Feurlicht was not dogmatic in this regards, but he was also fervent in believing in classical Reform Judaism and believing that the Enlightenment would somehow win out. And the tragic part was that really the beginning of the war was the end of this idea that of Jewish universalism, of looking at Jews as only being part of this Mosaic faith of the West, of looking at American exceptionalism. A lot of these different ideas that he held sacrosanct were just disappearing and eroding because of the pace of the world changing. And and like these are some of the examples that I gave. Um, and so Rabbi Feuerlich, his views on Zionism and Jewish particularism and Jewish peoplehood do evolve. In 1945, here's an article where he talks about how he's starting to accept this, sort of like a father who hesitantly doesn't like the person that his daughter or son is marrying. He kind of says, I'm accepting this person now. Um, I've learned more about them. I know more about this now. I understand why things have changed, where the world has shifted, um, and what's going on in the rest of the Jewish world. So these are just a couple of articles that discuss that. Um, some of the different changes from 1944 to 1945, and by 1940, by the end of the war, well, let me go back to this. Um, he was trying to bring the Jewish community together. He was really even though at the beginning of the war there was this division. He was also trying. He was also speaking at other synagogues, and one of the great speeches that he said at the Polish shul, I believe in '44, was he had this amazing quote: "God appeared to be asleep at the moment. Israel's enemies of the past are stuffed models in museums for Jews to sneer at." So what is he saying? Is he saying that you know look at Jewish history. Our enemies have perished. Um, you know, and these enemies will perish of the Jewish people. And yeah, I at first, yeah, I was asleep. I didn't see what was happening. And it's really easy to be tough on Rabbi Feuerlich and say, "How dare you didn't see this?" But most of Europe didn't see this. Most of the American Jewish establishment didn't see it playing out this way. And so we can in our hindsight, criticize and attack Rabbi Feuerlich, but instead of doing that, let's look at these different debates, these different ideas in Jewish history that happened, and how they played out, and how this memoir is an important work of tracing that development of the rabbinate during his time and looking at how Indiana's Jewish community um, dealt with situations that we kept on, saying, well, there's no precedent for this, there's no precedent for that. What do you do when there's no precedent and you are the leader of a Jewish community? And this was the situation that Rabbi Feuerlich was presented with. And so by 1946, um, he retired from IHC. His The rabbi took over from him, and this is another thing that's interesting. Rabbi Leo Franklin um, had a huge controversy because he said that his successor would not be from the Columbus platform, the group of Reform rabbis who were supporters of Zionism, of political Zionism. Rabbi Feuerlich was not of the same school. He said, I just want to have someone that I think can continue to lead into the future, and that's what's more important than what I believed. And so he accepted Rabbi Maurice Goldblatt who joined as a junior rabbi in 1938. And Rabbi Goldblatt came from a very different background. His family were Yiddish speaking Russian Jewish immigrants to Springfield, Illinois. He grew up on the kind of Zionism of Stephen Wise, and was very much that part of the Reform movement that Rabbi Feurlicht didn't really like, but he saw that the future, as a kind of statesman, that was where the future was going, and so as a person who was pragmatic, believed that that was the best person to move IHC forward. Now, unfortunately, whenever there's change, not everything that Rabbi Maurice Goldblatt wanted to do was fully accepted. He wanted to introduce more Hebrew, for example. The congregation didn't like that. They didn't like the fact that he wasn't as polished as a speaker or writer as Rabbi Feurlicht was. He could not fill his shoes, and so really it wasn't until Rabbi Maurice Davis who came, who understood through his own father, Rabbi Kronbach, who was another classical Reform rabbi who was originally from Indianapolis, that of what he needed to do to bring IHC back together, bring the Indianapolis Hebrew congregation back together by focusing mostly on issues that were domestic policy, by focusing on civil rights. Even though Rabbi Maurice Davis, like Rabbi Maurice Goldblatt, was also from a Yiddish-speaking background himself. His parents were immigrants from Ukraine. He was personally a Zionist himself, although he didn't talk about that a lot during his rabbinate in Indianapolis. So we can see, that sometimes um, that really what Rabbi Morris Feurlicht wanted people to remember was that he was a rabbi statesman. That he, even though he had these really strong opinions and he had these really strong standards that he would abide by, he was also a pragmatic person, understanding that sometimes you have to be pragmatic in order to ensure that the baton is passed on lador vador. And he trusted Rabbi Maurice Goldblatt in doing that, even though he didn't have the full confidence of all of the board of directors at IHC, and he understood that. So, and he wanted to, I think Rabbi Morris Feurlicht really wanted to be understood as a uniter and not as a divider, but also a person who at the same time stood up for the core beliefs that he really, really believed in, from his days at the Hebrew Union College in Cincinnati. So, do I have questions? I'd like to open up for questions now.
Did did Rabbi Froelich leave IHC on good terms?
He left IC on perfect terms, on great terms. He was well loved. Like I said, it wasn't. He was he was old. I mean, he had a stroke shortly after that he was dealing with in the 50s. He was getting up there in age. He knew he had to retire. He knew that there needed to be a change in leadership because the Jewish world had changed so much that he was no longer equipped to continue to move on. Just like Aaron and Moses knew that they couldn't take them into the promised land. He was a Moses, and so Moses had to pass the baton on. He was well loved. He's still well loved to this very day. Rabbi Maurice Goldblatt, unfortunately, a lot of people have criticisms of him still to this day that I hear. But he was put in a really difficult position at a time of transition.
I personally was very impressed with him. In fact, I think I have to move Eleanor Roosevelt out of my top 10 heroes and put him in because mostly of the interface stuff that he did. But I have a question. You had mentioned several times about his stand against and his work with the Ku Klux Klan. There was a rabbi in Terre Haute in the 20s, Rabbi Fink, who was also very, very active in anti-Klan stuff. Do you know if the two of them ever worked together in any of that?
Of course, yeah, they worked on multiple different committees within the Reform movement. They're both Reform movements. Uh, they're both Reform movement rabbis. They both had connections to the Hebrew College in Cincinnati. They're both on various different committees. and what would become the equivalent of what is the URJ today. So yeah, they were very close.
Thank you.
Other questions? Concerns? There's there's one quote that I wanted to leave some of the people with here, that I really, really love, that he put, this is one part I forgot and neglected to put in, that he wrote on the Nathan Morris Memorial Fountain, that was presented there in 1916. Nathan Morris died in a terrible fire. He was the person that the settlement home was named after, who was a prominent Jewish attorney, and actually the one of the first Jews to lead the Bar Association of Indianapolis. And Rabbi Feurlicht put this quote on this fountain that was there on Mass Avenue for many years before it was hit by a car and removed. Thus, the Jew of Indiana may claim his rightful and integral share in achieving the record which we of Indianapolis have acclaimed in such proud and gala fashion during the last fortnight. Separated from the fellow citizens of other faiths by his religion alone, he has shown himself to be possessed in every sense of these characteristics and virtues that have made Indiana a great state and a great union of states. And he believes himself to be quite as Hoosiery, as the Hoosierist, in the consciousness of his pride in Indiana's past and in the zealousness and realization of his hope and promise in Indiana's future. And so I've never seen such a beautiful quote about the Jews of Indiana from anyone than Rabbi Feurlicht from 1916. He adored and loved the state. He adored and loved the Jewish community here. I just forgot that last part that I wanted to put in as a postscript. I almost didn't click on that. So I'm glad I remembered to do that. Do I have any more questions? Anyone else who wants to say anything? Anything comes to mind here?
Very, very good. I appreciate all your research and very interesting presentation.
Well, I'm glad you enjoyed it. If you have any other questions about Rabbi Feurlicht or about Indiana Jewish history in general, you can reach me at michael.brown@ijhs.org. You can reach me there, and shoot me an email. I'm happy to talk to you, and I hope everyone's staying warm on this very, very cold day here in Indiana. Or you're in a place where it's warmer. Take care. Be well.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, Michael.
Sheila, are you still there?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah, it's Barbie. I'm
going to turn off the recording. Hold on one second.
Okay.
Such a good session, and he did such a nice job. And I'm really disappointed at our turnout. What can we do to increase these?
I think maybe more that Michael could have sent out